In Tudor England, words could be as dangerous as weapons, and for one young woman, words would lead her to fire. Anne Askew was just 25 when she was condemned to die, her body torn apart by torture, her spirit unbroken. She was carried to the stake because she could no longer stand. Yet even then, she refused to betray her faith or name others. Her execution shocked London. It was brutal, unforgettable, and unlike anything the city had seen before. But this story is not simply about Anne's death. It is about a kingdom drowning in paranoia, where religion was politics and defiance meant destruction. To understand why Anne Askew's final moments still haunt history, we must first enter the world of Henry VIII, a world where silence could save you, but truth could burn you alive. To understand Anne Askew's fate, we must step back into Tudor England, a kingdom where the line between faith and treason was razor thin. It was the final years of King Henry VIII's reign, a time when England was tearing itself apart over religion. The king had broken with Rome, declared himself head of the church, and yet the nation was far from united. Every sermon, every whispered conversation carried danger. For centuries, England had been Catholic. But now, new Protestant ideas were spreading quickly, igniting fierce debates in taverns, churches, and royal courts. With this came suspicion, betrayal, and brutal crackdowns. To speak the wrong words could mean prison. To refuse the right words could mean death. And in this world, women were expected to remain silent, obedient, unseen, unheard. They were never meant to preach, never meant to challenge the teachings of priests. But Anne Askew refused silence. Intelligent, outspoken, and unafraid, she quoted scripture, debated officials, and spread her beliefs openly. Her voice carried a conviction that unsettled the authorities. To them, she was not simply a heretic. She was something more dangerous, a woman who defied the roles assigned to her. And in a kingdom where defiance was punished by fire, her story was destined to end in flames. But before the rack, before the stake at Smithfield, there was the young woman herself. To understand why Anne risked everything, we must first look at her beginnings, her early life, her faith, and the beliefs that would one day seal her fate. Anne Askew was born in 1521 into a well-respected Lincolnshire family. Unlike most women of her time, she was educated. She could read, she could write, and more importantly, she had access to scripture, the very words that would shape both her life and her death. In a world where the Bible was still tightly controlled, Anne's literacy was a quiet act of rebellion in itself, but her life was never her own to shape. At just 15, she was forced into a marriage arranged by her father. Her husband, Thomas Kyme, was a staunch Catholic. Anne, by contrast, was drawn to the new Protestant teachings that questioned the authority of Rome and emphasized direct access to God through Scripture. Their marriage was doomed from the start. Anne's beliefs clashed violently with her husband's expectations. She was defiant, unwilling to conform, unwilling to stay silent. By her early 20s, Anne had separated from Kyme and left behind the role Tudor society demanded of her: obedient wife, quiet daughter. Instead, she became something far more dangerous, a woman who spoke her mind in public. She began to preach openly, quoting scripture, debating priests, and writing about her faith. Her words were sharp, uncompromising, and unafraid. She wrote of her convictions with a clarity and boldness that unsettled her opponents, that salvation came not through the church, but through faith alone. To authorities already fearful of Protestant influence, this was more than heresy. It was sedition, a challenge to the very order of Henry's kingdom. Anne's defiance marked her as an outsider, but also as a leader. For those who shared her beliefs, she was a beacon of courage. For those in power, she was a dangerous example, proof that even women expected to be silent could stand against them. And that, more than anything, made her intolerable. Because if one woman could question priests, challenge doctrine, and refuse obedience, what was to stop others from doing the same? Her voice was a spark, and the authorities feared it might become a fire. It was only a matter of time before the walls closed in. Anne Askew's outspokenness could not remain hidden for long. London was a city alive with whispers. of sermons, of new doctrines, of men and women daring to test the limits of what could be said. And Anne did more than test those limits. She crossed them boldly. She preached in public spaces, quoting scripture with the confidence of a scholar, and challenged priests who defended Catholic teachings. Her words were sharp, cutting through ritual and tradition. For some she was inspiring, for others she was dangerous. A woman speaking with authority in matters of faith was scandal enough. But a woman speaking against the established church, in the shadow of Henry VIII, was unthinkable. By 1545, her defiance reached the ears of the authorities. Anne was arrested for the first time, accused of heresy. She was interrogated, pressured to renounce her beliefs. Many in her position would have broken, but Anne did not. She spoke with composure, defended her convictions, and refused to betray others who shared her views. Lacking sufficient evidence, her enemies were forced to release her, but her freedom was temporary. She returned to her preaching, her writing, her relentless insistence on speaking truth as she saw it. Each word made her enemies more determined. The Bishop of London, alarmed by her growing influence, moved against her again. This time the charges were heavier, the questions sharper, the pressure immense. In a kingdom already divided by religion, Anne's refusal to bend marked her as a symbol. To Protestants, she became a voice of courage, unshaken by fear. To the authorities, she was a dangerous agitator, someone who could inspire others, even women, to resist. Her second arrest was no longer about silencing a preacher. It was about making an example. Anne was taken not simply as a suspect but as a warning. She would be interrogated, threatened, and pushed to the breaking point. And this time her enemies would not be satisfied with words. They wanted names. They wanted to crush the network of reformers around her. And for that, they would use not just prisons and threats, but pain unlike anything she had yet endured. The second arrest sealed Anne Askew's fate. Unlike her first imprisonment, this time she was taken not merely as a heretic, but as a threat to the stability of Henry VIII's kingdom. The authorities wanted more than her silence. They wanted names. Who supported her? Who else in London dared share her faith? Anne was transferred to the Tower of London, the fortress that had swallowed so many before her. There she faced one of the most feared instruments of Tudor justice, the rack, a device of wood and iron, designed to tear the human body apart. Victims were bound by the wrists and ankles, then stretched by turning wheels until joints snapped, muscles tore, and bones threatened to break. For most, the agony was unbearable. But Anne Askew was not most. She was questioned repeatedly, urged to betray others, noble women at court, even the Queen herself. If she confessed, the pain could end. If she named names, her body might be spared. But Anne refused. The torment continued. Her shoulders were dislocated, her hips torn from their sockets. By the end, her body was so broken that she could no longer stand. And still, she would not speak the words her interrogators demanded. Witnesses later recalled her calm defiance, her refusal to surrender even as her body was destroyed. The lieutenant of the tower, horrified at the cruelty, reportedly ended the torture himself. When it was over, Anne Askew was crippled for life. She had to be carried from the rack, her limbs shattered, her body mangled beyond repair. Yet her silence had been unshakable. She had given her tormentors nothing. At that moment, Anne Askew ceased to be simply a prisoner. She became a symbol, a woman whose body could be broken, but whose spirit remained untouchable. But for the authorities, this defiance made her all the more dangerous. If they could not silence her in the tower, then they would silence her in fire. And so, the decision was made. The rack had failed to crush her words, but the flames would consume her body. The stage was set for her final punishment. One meant not just to kill her, but to turn her death into a warning for all of London. On July 16, 1546, London awoke to the grim news. 4 heretics were to be burned at Smithfield. Public executions were theater, spectacles meant to terrify the living into obedience. But this day was different. Among the condemned was a young woman, broken in body, but unbroken in spirit, Anne Askew. She could not walk. The torture rack had left her crippled, her joints torn apart, her body shattered. So they carried her on a chair, parading her through the streets. Crowds lined the path, staring in silence as the pale, thin figure passed. Some pitied her, others scorned her, but none could ignore her. At Smithfield, the stake awaited. Beside her stood 3 men, fellow Protestants condemned for their beliefs. Together they were chained to the wood, surrounded by bundles of kindling. The air was heavy with smoke, the crowd restless, the moment charged with fear. Anne said little. Her strength had been drained by torture, yet her composure startled witnesses. Even in agony, she showed no fear of the fire.
As the flames were lit, the crackling roar swallowed the square.
The heat surged upward, the smoke stung the air.
The condemned cried out, some in prayer, some in pain, and in the midst of it all, Anne Askew endured, her frail body consumed, but her defiance unbroken. For those watching, it was unforgettable. A young woman, crippled by torture, burned alive not for murder or treason, but for words, for faith, for refusing to be silent. That day, Smithfield became more than a place of execution. It became the stage for one of the most gruesome female deaths in English history, and in the making of a martyr whose story would echo far beyond the smoke of the fire. Anne Askew's body was reduced to ash that day at Smithfield, but her execution refused to fade from memory. In London, the spectacle left a mark of horror. Many in the crowd went home shaken, unable to forget the image of a young woman so crippled she had to be carried to her own burning. For others, especially Protestants, her composure in the flames turned her from victim into martyr. In the months that followed, whispers spread through the city. Anne had not betrayed her companions, not even under the rack. She had gone to her death unbroken. In a society where women were expected to submit, she had defied priests, interrogators, even the king's justice itself. That made her story dangerous, yet her enemies could not silence her. Before her death, Anne had written accounts of her interrogations and her beliefs. These were smuggled out of prison and published soon after her execution. Known as the Examinations of Anne Askew, they became one of the first books in England written by a woman. Her words, clear, bold, and defiant, gave her a voice long after the fire had taken her life. For the authorities, this was a bitter irony. They had destroyed her body to erase her influence. Instead, they had immortalized her. Anne's writings inspired others, fueling the Protestant cause that Henry's regime had tried so hard to suppress. Her story became proof that faith could survive even the rack and the flames. Anne Askew was gone, but she had achieved what few in Tudor England could. She had spoken her truth, endured the unendurable, and left behind a legacy that not even the fire could burn away. Yet to understand the full weight of her story, we must look beyond the flames of Smithfield. Because Anne's death was not only the end of a life, it was the mirror of a kingdom. A kingdom where truth was dangerous, where silence meant survival, and where kings and bishops used fire to shape belief. Her story is not just about one woman's death. It is about the world that killed her, a world where truth was dangerous, where silence meant survival, and where kings and bishops used fire to shape belief. In Tudor England, religion was never only faith. It was power. It was politics. And anyone who challenged that balance risked everything. Anne challenged it anyway. She stood as a woman in a man's world, speaking words that no one wanted to hear. For her courage, she was tortured, broken, and burned alive. But in the end, her executioners failed. Her voice carried further than they imagined. Her writings became weapons sharper than any blade, preserved for generations to read. Her death still forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth. How far will those in power go to silence a single voice? How much fear must a kingdom carry to turn a 25-year-old woman into an enemy of the state? And perhaps most haunting of all, how many other stories like Anne's have been lost, erased by fire and silence? Anne Askew's body was destroyed, but her defiance lived on. She remains a reminder that even in the darkest corners of history, truth can survive the flames. And her story is just one reminder of how cruel and fragile life could be under the weight of power. A single belief, a single word, could decide whether you lived or burned. But now I want to hear from you. What do you think was Anne's greatest act of defiance? Was it her refusal to betray others, her unshaken faith, or her calm in the flames? Share your thoughts in the comments below.
And if you want more stories where history proves darker than fiction, don't forget to like this video, subscribe, and join me for the next chapter.